Trump tries to do these sort of operations, when markets are closed, and hopefully it's all wrapped up by the time markets are open. But here we are with markets open, and obviously it doesn't look like there's any immediate end in sight. It's kind of very hard to see, where we go from here and what the off ramps are for this.
Hello, welcome to the show. And we have had such a momentous week, especially with Geopolitics, that I am so pleased to be able to welcome Tom Bailey from HANetf. Thank you so much for rushing in for us. Of course, we've seen, the news headlines to do with, Iran over the weekend. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to tell right now. This started Friday night / Saturday morning, depends which time zone you're in. And the idea kind of a lot of people have is that, Trump tries to do these sort of operations, or so to speak, when markets are closed, and hopefully it's all wrapped up by the time markets are open. But here we are with markets open, and obviously it doesn't look like there's any immediate end in sight to kind of the fallout of the initial attacks on Iran by Israel and the US, and then obviously Iran's response through hitting various different US assets in the region, as well as various different countries such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and obviously we can see now a drone has hit a RAF base in Cyprus. So it's kind of very hard to see, where we go from here and how what the off ramps are for this. Iran obviously seems very dedicated to striking back against the US, and where the US kind of attempts to dial it down, or whether they do or not, remains to be seen. But for now, it looks like no clear end in sight. Obviously, who knows what's going on in terms of talks and strategy behind the scenes, but obviously it's clearly still in escalatory mode. And it's a reminder to us that, for years we've been talking about this idea of we live in a more geopolitically volatile world. And obviously the event itself in terms of the US and Israel striking Iran is evidence of that. But then so too is the broadening out of the war almost immediately from the start. Obviously hitting places like the United Arab Emirates, particularly the city of Dubai, which have kind of tried to build themselves as these kind of global trading hubs. Obviously, while engaged in geopolitics, trying to not be seen as kind of part of any single bloc. But
and
obviously,
yet
hit. And obviously, the untold damage it's going to do to places like Dubai's reputation, but also as a reminder for other countries around the world that this new era of geopolitical volatility, even if you want to try and avoid it, sometimes it can't be avoided.
Clearly, Tom, you're very tapped into the defense sector. We often cross paths at the DSEI. We're at different tents, but hey. And also you speak to many of these contractors because of the NATO ETF. What's the mood music like? What's everyone saying?
Well, I think when we think about the various different components of the defence sector and the news we've seen over the weekend and continuing into the start of today, I think there's two kind of areas I want to look at. So obviously this has principally been a missile and drone war from the start. And so when you see, for example, the kind of ballistic and cruise missile attacks on US assets and also those Gulf states I mentioned, we can see within that the importance of missile defense and these high-end missile defense systems. Most of the damage hasn't been coming from those Iranian missiles. They have principally been intercepted by systems like Patriot and FAD. And so this is positive for, those companies such as RTX and Lockheed Martin that produce these, and they do provide very high-end, very expensive missile defense that works. But the other area which I think will be concerning to governments around the world is obviously the use of drones. So not to say this is the first use of drones in the way we've seen. Obviously they've been used to horrible effects in Ukraine. Obviously the same types of drones that were originally designed by Iran and then licensed out for production in Russia. But if we see what actually was getting through the UAE and Bahraini and Saudi and Kuwaiti air defenses, it is these drones, which are obviously very cheap to make. They can cost as little as $20,000 to produce. So they are produced and then deployed at scale, and they do get through these high-end air defenses. So what governments need to obviously invest in, and obviously this has been a key talking point within Europe recently, is anti-drone or counter-drone technology. If you think of these high-end missile platforms, anti-missile systems, it can cost millions per missile to intercept a drone, which only costs $20,000. So the asymmetry there is highly concerning for these countries. And so how you manage to kind of counter this mass drone attacks, which is why I think we're going to see lots more focus on this kind of counter drone technology. Various different companies might be pure play out there, like stuff like Drone Shields, the Australian company, or with some of the kind of more established primes out there. They have obviously their own counter-drone products for governments. You can see, for example, HANetf has been kind of one of the pioneers in developing counter-drone technology within Europe. And so I think the conversation is going to shift a lot more to counter-drone technology, more so than it already has already.
Speaking of counter-drone, as you know, I was at the DSAI looking at all these companies that create counter-drones. One in particular that I went to look at was Kinetic, and they have the Dragonfire, but also Red Cat Holdings. This is the maker of modular drones there. I mean, their stand was so busy, I couldn't get someone to actually speak to me to actually look at their stuff. That was how busy they were. But what also fascinates me, Tom, is how fast this space is moving. I saw some makers of drones and anti-drone technology, and they were talking about how a lot of drones these days are looking at using materials like polystyrene, so that you can't have any sort of metal sensing radar, and it can't be tracked. There is a huge amount of interest in this space, and I hear that HANetf might have something interesting coming along very soon. I'm looking at you doing this because I've been waiting.
Yeah, so we're expecting to launch a drone ETF in coming days. So obviously, a lot of investors might look at defense ETFs for exposure to this new drone, kind of this new era of drone warfare, but also proliferation of drones more generally. But we do think investors want that kind of targeted pure play exposure to drones itself. And so that's what we've been looking at. There's several kind of these pure play drone makers out there, as well as obviously the business divisions of various different existing defense companies which produce drones. So we do think that this is drones are part of the broader defense theme and sector, but at the same time we think investors want that specific exposure to drones. But it's not just a defense aspect when you talk about drones. Obviously, the biggest market is defense, and it's likely to remain so. But the fastest growing market for drones is actually commercial. So this is used for stuff like in agriculture, for crop inspection or crop dusting.
That's right.
So I think in Japan, 90% of crop dusting in agriculture now is done with drones. And then also you can see broader cases such as, for inspection for industrial sites, for construction sites. If you want to inspect, a wind turbine out in the sea, it's very dangerous and costly to send someone to go and inspect that themselves. A drone is such an obvious other use. So, we talk about drones, defense is a key part, but there's also this broader case there.
Nice. We like a double bubble here, and I notice that being mirrored by the size of the drones too. So you'll find that we go to these events, or rather I go to these events expecting tiny drones and the size to get smaller. In fact, because of what Tom's talking about and the multiple uses of drones, you're actually seeing some of them get larger for stability.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing too is, many of you watching this space might be thinking, right, future defense, I'm already in NATO. Full disclosure, I do have a position in NATO way before all this. Why then, if you've already got exposure to defense, why then have a drone ETF?
Yeah, I think, it's about honing in on that particular growth area. And, it's not about trying to kind of simply say, these companies, some of these big defense primes have drone exposure. Any drone product is going to have to be focused on some of the pure play names within that. So you do get that extra exposure. So you can decide, you might want your broader defense exposure, and then you might want to have that targeted drone exposure. And then at the same time, appreciating that there will be drone companies in there which are not necessarily defense companies, and they wouldn't. So when you look at defense ETFs, often what you're doing when you construct a defense ETF is you're doing revenue screens for how much of the equipment a company sells as defense equipment, right? So for example, you might see in a lot of defense ETFs, there is no Boeing, right? So Boeing obviously has a role within defense and it does sell defense products, but more of its revenue comes from commercial airlines. So you can see that with say drone companies, right? So they might have maybe 20-30% of their revenue deriving from the sale of drones for military use. But if that's not the bulk of the revenue, they're not going to be included in those broader defense ETFs. So at the same time, it's trying to, it's taking. If you look at a defense ETF, you're saying, this is the broad theme, the sector I want. And then with drones, you're taking the broad theme of the rise of essentially these remote operated systems, which might have very different uses.
Right. Thank you very much, Tom. I look forward to welcoming you back again to talk more about this new ETF once it's out and you can elaborate on it. Thank you very much, everyone. Any questions, please pop them down here for myself or for Tom Bailey. We'll make sure that we get them asked. Also hit the like and subscribe button because that enables us to bring you more of this great content and you can watch them from the comforts of your home. Right. Whatever you're doing today, may you stack the odds in your favor.